Welcome to another Research Spotlight episode at Synthesis Workshop. I'm your host Reem, and today we have a special guest, Kelvin Wu, a graduate student in Professor Andrew Meyer's research group at Harvard University. Kelvin, thank you for joining us today, and we're excited to hear about your research. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Reem, for your kind introduction and invitation to present our laboratory's work on this Research Spotlight episode. Today, I'm very excited to share with you our research over the past decade on the lincosamide class of antibiotics. Our work culminated in the discovery of a fully synthetic antibiotic that is highly pre-organized for binding to the bacterial ribosome and which overcomes multiple modes of antimicrobial resistance. The lincosamides are ribosome-binding antibiotics with limited modern clinical utility. Its founding member, lincomycin, was isolated by Upjohn in 1963 from a streptomycete in Lincoln, Nebraska. FDA approval for its use as an antibacterial agent was granted just 1 year later in 1964. In 1970, lincomycin was semi-synthetically modified at the C7 position via a stereoinvertive deoxychlorination to yield clindamycin, which was found to be more effective as an antibacterial agent and has largely supplanted lincomycin in clinical use as a gram-positive facing antibiotic. However, clindamycin, more so than any other antibiotic, carries an increased risk of C. difficile-associated colitis, and its use has therefore been largely relegated to topical applications or for serious infections with no other alternatives. More than 50 years later today, no new lincosamide has since been introduced to the market, and following decades of use, multiple forms of antimicrobial resistance have emerged which render clindamycin ineffective. For both descriptive and synthetic practicality, the lincosamides can be structurally separated into two halves by retrosynthetic hydrolysis of the central amide bond to form a northern amino-octose fragment and an elaborated proline residue as a southern fragment. In 2021, a team from our laboratory reported the discovery of the semi-synthetic antibiotic Iboxamycin, which features a synthetic bicyclic oxypanoproline southern fragment colored in blue, coupled to the northern 7-chloromethylthiolincosamine component of clindamycin, or 7-chloro-MTL for short, colored in red. Iboxamycin displayed an expanded spectrum of activity compared to clindamycin, most notably against C. difficile and gram-negative pathogens such as E. coli, K. pneumoniae, and A. baumannii. Iboxamycin is also active against gram-positive bacteria expressing rRNA methyltransferases that confer widespread resistance to multiple classes of antibiotics. For example, erythromycin resistance methyltransferase, or ERM for short, confers cross-resistance to macrolides, lincosamides, and streptogrammin B antibiotics, collectively known as MLSB. Chloramphenicol flufenicol resistance methyltransferase, or CFR for short, confers cross-resistance to phenicols, lincosamides, oxazolidinones, pleromutilins, and streptogrammin A antibiotics, collectively known as FLOPS-A. Panels A through F in this slide depict the co-crystal structure of iboxamycin, shown in yellow, bound to the wild-type ribosome of the bacterium Thermus thermophilus. As a class, the lincosamides are bacteriostatic antibiotics and prevent bacterial growth by binding to the peptidotransferase center, or PTC for short, of the large 50S ribosomal subunit and arresting protein synthesis, as shown in panels A and B. The improved spectrum of activity for iboxamycin relative to its predecessor clindamycin, shown in green and blue in panel C, can be attributed to the further extension of its isobutyl side chain by the rigid oxypane ring compared to the shorter propyl side chain of clindamycin. More specifically, in panel E, iboxamycin presents its isobutyl side chain into a hydrophobic A side cleft bound by rRNA nucleobases A2451, C2452, and U2506. As seen in panel F, this prevents the accommodation of the amino A cell-bearing 3' CCA terminus of an incoming A site tRNA, thus inhibiting translation initiation. While we are on this slide,
I would also like to describe the two resistance mechanisms, ERM and CFR methyltransferases, which were discussed in the previous slide. In the canonical lincosamide binding site, shown in panel D, ERM methyltransferases dimethylate the exocyclic nitrogen of nucleobase A2058, while the CFR methyltransferase methylates C8 of nucleobase A2503. Both of these modifications disrupt key hydrogen bonding interactions within the PTC binding site and thus result in the dramatic MLSB and FLOPS-A cross-resistance observed across multiple classes of ribosome-binding antibiotics. At the end of the presentation, there will be a short video which will describe these binding interactions and resistance mechanisms in greater detail. Following our report on the discovery and semi-synthesis of iboxamycin, we sought to modify its northern 7-chloro-methylthiolincosamine fragment, which, as you may recall, has remained completely unmodified from clindamycin. We studied the 6 published co-crystal structures of ribosome-bound iboxamycin and clindamycin, and identified 3 key dihedral angles in the northern fragment for further analysis. In each of these 6 structures, the antibiotics adopt conformations that place the thiomethyl group as C1 gauche to the endocyclic CO bond, subtending a mean dihedral angle theta of 66 plus minus 6 degrees. Of note, this conformation is one of 2 that are stabilized by the exoanomeric effect, where the S-lone pair is antiperiplanar to the CO sigma star orbital. We also recognize that the antibiotics adopt conformations with the 7-chloro-substituent gauche to the vicinal CN bond of the amide residue, subtending a mean dihedral angle phi of minus 63 plus minus 6 degrees, and with the hydrogen atoms located on C5 and C6 antiperiplanar to each other, subtending a mean dihedral angle alpha of 174 plus minus 6 degrees. Despite being otherwise freely rotatable, these dihedral angles remain remarkably consistent across all the assessed co-crystal structures. We hypothesized that if we could find a way to pre-organize these rotatable bonds into their preferred binding conformations, we could potentially lower the entropy cost of binding and thus increase the overall affinity of the molecule for the bacterial ribosome. To this end, we imagined linking the thiomethyl residue as C1 with the chloroethyl residue as C7 by macrocyclization via a Z olefin. The resulting bridged 10-member macrobicycle, which we have named cresomycin, was anticipated to conformationally restrict the molecule into its ideal binding conformation and thus reduce the entropic penalty of PTC engagement. With a design for cresomycin in hand, we sought to develop a viable synthetic route towards this molecule. Since cresomycin had only been a product of our imagination up to this point, we were not even certain at the onset of the program whether such a product could physically exist, much less be synthesized in useful amounts. With this caveat in mind, we designed our synthesis to favor established and robust transformations to maximize our chances of success. For example, we envisioned achieving the key macrocyclization using ring-closing olefin metathesis, a well-precedented disconnection for the formation of medium-sized macrocycles. This foresight turned out to bear significant merit, for we were able to perform the synthesis of cresomycin on not just a discovery scale initially, but on gram scale using the same route as well. The synthetic scheme for our largest gram scale batch is detailed in the following slides. Our synthesis started from the known tetrabenzoylated alpha-thioglycoside 1, which in our hands was accessible from D-galactose on 100 gram scale. S-alkylation of 1 with 4-bromo-1-butene, followed by selective deprotection of the primary benzoyl group using Altera's organostannane catalyst, afforded alcohol 2 in 66% yield over 2 steps. Oxidation of 2 with the desmartin periodinane, followed by condensation with Elman's tert-butanesulfinamide, afforded sulfinamide 3 in 82% yield over 2 steps. The next two transformations from sulfinamide 3 are worth going into greater detail, for they form the key stereodiet at C6 and C7, as well as the Z macrobiotic cycle in cresomycin. The treatment of 3 with chromium zinc chloride at -108 degrees Celsius yielded 3A and 3A prime with R and S stereochemistry at C7 respectively, in a ratio of 85:15. These diastereomers were found to be inseparable by chromatography at this stage. Instead, we found it expedient to simply subject the mixture of diastereomers directly to ring closing metathesis using the Grobs2 catalyst in refluxing toluene for 15 minutes, upon which the major diastereomer 3A was found to cyclize exclusively to the desired Z macrobiotic cycle 4, whereas the minor diastereomer 3A prime cyclized exclusively to the E macrobiotic cycle 4 prime. Gratifyingly, 4 and 4 prime were found to be separable by flash column chromatography, likely due to their substantial differences in molecular architecture. This sequence afforded the 10-membered macrobiotic cycle 4 in 51% yield over 2 steps after a single repurification of mixed fractions. The rather unconventional conditions for ring closing metathesis are also worth expanding upon. In our initial stages of screening, we observed that competitive dimerization of 3A and 3A prime to form the 20-membered macrocycles was a major reaction pathway that resulted in challenging purifications and diminished yields. We found that a set of conditions reported by the Danishevsky group, using a combination of high temperature, low concentration, and short reaction time, strongly favored the desired monomeric product. However, for our system, we further discovered that it was also necessary to destroy the Grobs catalyst with DMSO prior to cooling and concentration of the reaction mixture. If the catalyst is not destroyed in this manner, concentration of the reaction mixture after the reaction is complete resulted in the undesired ring opening of the monomeric products followed by dimerization. With the key transformations complete and the desired macrobiotic cycle 4 in hand, global benzoyl deprotection with sodium methoxide, followed by sulfinamide deprotection using hydrochloric acid, afforded a macrobiotic cyclic amine 5 in 72% yield over 2 steps and in 1 gram amount over a single iteration of the synthetic sequence. Lastly, amide coupling of 5 with the en-Bloc protected oxapenoproline derivative 6 using HA2 for carboxyl activation, followed by en-Bloc removal, delivered cresomycin in 69% yield over 2 steps and in amounts sufficient for single crystal X-ray analysis as well as in vivo studies. When assessed in vitro, cresomycin demonstrated potent growth inhibition of modern multi-drug resistant gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria compared to clindamycin and other clinically prescribed antibiotics. Shown here in this table are the minimum inhibitory concentrations, or MICs, in micrograms per mil required for each antibiotic to inhibit the growth of the assessed bacterial strains. Obviously, we do not have the time to go through the entire table, but I hope to point out some important overall trends for everyone to take home. First, genes that are known to confer resistance to lincosamides are highlighted in red. This includes the ERM and CFR methyltransferases, which we have previously discussed, as well as other resistance determinants such as LSAA, VGAA, and CPLR, which I will not be discussing in detail today. Second, clindamycin was found to be ineffective against all but one of the isolates in this panel. Third, cresomycin is highly effective against multi-drug resistant gram-positive pathogens, expressing a wide variety of resistance mechanisms that render clindamycin and other antibiotics ineffective. Lastly, cresomycin is also effective against multi-drug resistant gram-negative bacteria, including high-priority clinical isolates derived from the CDC Antimicrobial Resistance Bank. To assess if the in vitro efficacy of cresomycin translates to in vivo models, we selected the CFR and expressing S aureus isolates banded in gray and orange, as well as the carbapenem-resistant E. coli and P. aeruginosa isolates banded in green and purple for testing in murine models of infection. In a systemic infection model, shown in panel A, we found that cresomycin rescues mice from an otherwise fatal infection of the CFR expressing S. aureus intraperitoneally administered at 90% lethal dose. Following just 1 day of subcutaneous treatment with cresomycin at 25 mg per kilogram QID, or 4 times a day, 10 out of 10 mice survived for 7 days post-infection. In contrast, 9 out of 10 mice receiving vehicle perished within 2 days post-infection. In separate mouse neutropenic thigh infection models, shown in panels B and C, intraperitoneal administration of cresomycin at the specified doses significantly reduced the bacterial burden of CFR-expressing S. aureus, ERM-A-expressing S. aureus, carbapenem-resistant E. coli, and carbapenem-resistant P. aeruginosa relative to untreated controls. For ease of reference, the MIC profiles of these isolates are reproduced at the bottom of the slide. It is sobering to remember that many of these multi-drug resistant isolates are not simply academic curiosities, but actual clinical isolates derived from a nosocomial setting. To verify our pre-organization hypothesis, we calculated the ground state conformation of cresomycin using DFT, reconstructed its solution state conformation experimentally using NOESY-NMR, and determined its solid state conformation using single crystal X-ray diffraction, shown in panels A, B, and C, respectively. Lastly, we determined the conformation of cresomycin bound to the T thermophilus bacterial ribosome, shown in panel D. The macrobicyclic substructures in ribosome-bound cresomycin and its conformations in solution and in the solid state were essentially identical. Together, these results reveal that cresomycin assumes a single macrobicyclic conformation that is highly pre-organized for binding to bacterial ribosomes. We can further quantify the degree of pre-organization by assessing the distribution of accessible conformations for cresomycin and iboxamycin, calculated using DFT and arranged in ascending order of relative energy. The black arrow depicts the first accessible conformation of cresomycin with a different spatial arrangement of its macrobicyclic scaffold, alongside its relative energy of plus 9.2 kcal per mole as a dotted line. Under this line, there are 28 accessible conformations for iboxamycin, compared to 7 for cresomycin. Next, we can ask how each of these conformations differ from their respective ground states. For iboxamycin, the dihedral angles theta, phi, and alpha, plotted in red, gray, and blue respectively, are highly dynamic relative to the ground state. The accessible conformations of iboxamycin feature facile rotations about its sulfur to C1, C6 to C7, and C5 to C6 bonds. This is unlike cresomycin, where most of the accessible conformations retain close similarity to their ground state. Lastly, to understand how cresomycin effectively inhibits the growth of bacterial strains expressing the methyltransferases CFR and ERM, we obtained co-crystal structures of cresomycin bound to ERM-modified and CFR-modified ribosomes. Normally, ERM-mediated dimethylation of A2058 results in extensive steric clash with the hydroxyl groups of the amino octose northern fragment of clindamycin, thereby reducing binding affinity and conferring resistance. By virtue of its pre-organization in both the northern and southern fragments, and despite not having changed anything with these hydroxyl groups, cresomycin is able to overcome ERM resistance by instead displacing the N6 dimethylated A2058 nucleobase, shown in dark blue, by almost 2 angstroms, effectively restructuring the ribosomal binding pocket to allow cresomycin to retain the same position and conformation that it adopts within the wild-type ribosome. This is clearly not a trivial concession for the nucleobase to make, as we know that ERM dimethylation of A2058 grants strong protection to numerous other PTC binding antibiotics that is not easy to overcome. Comparison of the wild-type and CFR co-crystal structures show that both cresomycin and the CFR methylated nucleobase make concessive adjustments to allow cresomycin to maintain binding. Cresomycin displaces the C8 methylated A2503 nucleobase, shown in dark blue, by 0.6 angstroms, while itself being displaced at its amide carbonyl by approximately 1 angstrom. Upon deflection by the CFR methylated A2503, The carbonyl oxygen atom of cresomycin is brought closer to and establishes van der Waals contact with a C7 methyl group, seemingly precluded from further displacement along its original trajectory. Like the CFR-mediated methylation of A2503 affects the binding of the molecule at a site that has remained completely unchanged from clindamycin to cresomycin, namely the amide linkage. Finally, as promised, please enjoy this short video which provides a succinct summary of the various ribosomal co-crystallography studies that we have discussed today. With that, I would like to thank our collaborators at UIC, Elena and Igor from the lab of Professor Yuri Polikonov, as well as Professor Maxim Svetlov for their invaluable contributions to the project. I would also like to thank Professor Richard Liu for his helpful contributions towards our computational experiments. Last but not least, I wish to extend my heartfelt gratitude to my mentor, Professor Andrew Myers, as well as all the past and present members of the Myers Group. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelvin, for your awesome talk. It was a pleasure having you on our channel today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to today's episode, and we hope to see you next time at Synthesis Workshop.